Everyone, it's Christina of CraftyPaws. This is episode 2 of my Copic hair coloring video series. So I colored up in advance the skin on this little cutie here. She is Flutter Anya from the Greeting Farm, and I thought it would be fun to try and color up these little mini buns on top of her head and share with you guys my thought process of where to put shadows and highlights. So I'm trying to find the bumps, kind of the rounded areas of her hair where I think the highlights should be. So the top little segment there and that bottom segment of hair, those rounded areas are where I think the light would hit and would have the most highlighting. So I'm taking a blue B01 Copic marker and I'm just doing some flicking, leaving a lot of white space where I think the highlights would be the brightest. In this back section here, I'm leaving an even bigger kind of white highlighted area because I think the light could be shining kind of from above and in front of this little fairy. For this little swatch of hair coming in front of her face, I'm putting the highlight right in the middle, kind of the biggest area of that swatch of hair. I'm going to turn the fairy around so that I can do some flicking, again, a little bit towards me, but mostly away from me because I find flicking, for me anyway, is easier when I have the image so that I can flick away. And I'm using the same idea, the widest area, the kind of bump, the biggest bump area of the image is where I'm putting the highlights in. Now for these little mini buns, it's a little bit tricky. I'm imagining the light source from this fairy being kind of in the front of her. So the little swirls in her little mini buns are going to be highlighted right in the center areas of those spaces. So the swirl in the front will have the blue or highlighted areas in the center of those little spaces. And in the side areas there, I'm trying to give the highlights in the widest area of those side spaces. You'll see it a little bit clearer, I think, when you see the next medium gray being added. That's a C6. It's a cool gray, and I wanted to give the blue highlights for this cool gray, which is going to end up looking like black hair, actually. And I'm placing this cool gray 6 in all the areas that I think should be in shadow. And first off, I'm just kind of following the lines in this fairy image. And it's an easier way of kind of knowing where the artist who drew the stamp thinks the shadows should be or could be. And it's an easy way to start anyway, trying to figure out where the shadows would go. So for the side here, you can see I'm following along the lines, and then I might do a little bit of flicking just at the edges because that's where the shadows would fall on a rounded head. You can see that I'm trying to add a little bit more shadow underneath kind of that front swath of hair, and I'm extending a little bit the lines just so that this complicated area right there where there's a little divot in the middle of her head and over to the right, because that front swath of hair, her bangs kind of go to the left, it creates kind of a complicated hair part. And I'm thinking about that as I go to kind of trace the lines of the little mini buns. So I'm doing that, but I'm also thinking about how I'm going to connect that top part of the little fairy's head and where I'm going to have the shadows, because it's not a very clear part in this image, the hair part that is. I'm adding some shadows on the edges of this mini bun where the mini bun meets the rest of the head. I'm following the lines of the swirls in that mini bun, and you can see I'm doing a little bit of flicking, and it's such a small space, I'm having a hard time keeping the highlighted areas lighter. And I think at the end, I end up losing most of the highlight, but you can kind of still see a little bit of where the bun shadows are. Now I've decided right in the middle where that divot is in her head, that's where I'm going to add the main part. So I'm placing the darkest shadows there. And then for that bump over on the right, I decide, oh, maybe I could extend the highlighted area a little bit so that it captures that bump on the left side of her head. Now I'm going back in with that same C6 and I'm putting in that part there. Now this area here is a little bit complicated. I decide to extend that part, but then I'm also kind of creating a part where that little bang swath of hair would come from. So I'm creating lines that go in a different direction. So you see going kind of down her head on the back area swath and then down the front of that bang area. You see the flicking going down along the path of the bang. Now I've decided to go with my darkest shade. This is where the real shadowing is going to come in and where I think the real three-dimensionality of the coloring comes in when you add that extreme dark color. So I'm using a C9 and I'm pretty much following where I had established where the shadows would be, kind of testing the shadow areas with the C6. I'm extending the flicking areas and I think it's already starting to look a little bit more like hair rather than kind of chunks with outlining. Next, I'm tackling the bang area and just adding a little bit of extra flicking, following along where the lines of the image are, but adding some flicking in between to kind of keep it so that it doesn't look like outlining. But I'm adding darker areas, the longer flicks where those lines are. I'm also trying to leave a little bit of space between these dark color flicks. Not a lot, but a little bit so that I have room to add the lighter gray colors back in as well so that it doesn't look super flat, even in the darkest areas. Now I'm following the kind of quasi part where the bang comes from in the dark shades, and I'm following along the edges of her head, again, trying to create the illusion of the darkest shadow along the edge where her hair meets her face. Again, trying to just flick along the curves, the same kind of arch as are in the drawing of her head to create the illusion that this is not flat, that her head is actually, rounded 3D. Now I'm following along where the little mini bun meets the head, creating the darkest shadows there again. I have a little bit of a heavy hand, so you see that I am struggling a little bit here trying to establish the darkest shadows while still maintaining the highlighting there. I think it's okay, but if I had it to do again, I might skip this darkest Copic marker in this tiny area and maybe even just switch to a Copic multi-liner pen. Those really thin pens that I normally use to kind of darken up eyes that are very small, I might go back and do it that way and not use the brush tip of a normal Copic marker, but use a Copic multi-liner pen. Now I'm going back in with a medium cool gray again. This is the C6, and I'm extending the areas of shadow. And that kind of blends the whitest or blue areas, the highlighted areas, with those darkest shadowed areas. And it kind of takes the drawing or coloring from being a little bit more chunky to a little bit more realistic. Just that extra blending again with the medium tone. This is the same color that I had used to test out where I wanted the shadows, and now I'm using it to blend the darkest to the lightest areas. And adding this extra flicking also adds extra texture, and that texture is really what gives the hair coloring, making that hair coloring look more like individual strands of hair, which obviously it's not. And I'm just following along the same curves of the image head again, and just extending a little bit further than where the darkest shadows were placed. As you can see, it's already starting to look more like hair. I go in and try to reestablish the blending even in the little mini buns, but I think it ends up covering most of the highlighted areas. I try to retain as much as I can, but you know, it is what it is. Now I'm going in with an even lighter gray. This is a C4, and I'm doing that so that I kind of take away the stark white areas of the highlighted areas of her head, and I'm muting it a little bit with this pale gray. And I think that that adds a little bit more of a blended, more natural color, which is actually ironic because I end up going back in with the blue in a minute to accentuate the shine, which I think the blue really brings out. With black hair, I really like adding this blue highlighting color because if you look at black hair in bright sunlight, you often see kind of a blue undertone. And I like that kind of shiny look to black hair. And I think the blue really adds a lot of that kind of shiny appearance. And I'm re-establishing the blue highlights in the mini buns as well. Now the last step is going back in, as I always do in all of my hair coloring. I reestablish the darkest shade that I'm using, and I do that, as I've mentioned before, because when you add lighter colors after you establish the darkest shadows, it bleaches out some of the darkest pigment from the areas where you put in that darkest color. So taking this one last step of adding back in the darkest color for hair really makes the hair coloring pop and puts back in that full range of light to dark coloring. And I think that that full range is what really makes hair colors look more realistic. And this last step I do with as light a touch as I possibly can. The wispier, the thinner these flick marks are, the more it's going to look like real hair. And I think those thin little flick marks really add the best texture and that final touch that eliminates the chunky kind of looking areas in highlights that are often left when you're just doing quick hair coloring. It's not a big deal, but if you want to kind of take your hair coloring to that next level, that full range of light to dark coloring. And I think that that full range is what really makes hair colors look more realistic. And this last step I do with as light a touch as I possibly can. The wispier, the thinner these flick marks are, the more it's going to look like real hair. And I think those thin little flick marks really add the best texture and that final touch that eliminates the chunky kind of looking areas in highlights that are often left when you're just doing quick hair coloring. It's not a big deal, but if you want to kind of take your hair coloring to that next level, those really light touch flicks can help add that realistic texture to hair coloring. I hope you guys enjoyed this Copic coloring process video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. I'm no Copic coloring expert. I'm just trying to share what little I know, and I hope it's helpful to you guys. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys are having a wonderful crafty day.